Hello and welcome to this video. In this playlist, we're talking about the CKA, Certificate Kubernetes Administrator. Now we are in the cluster architecture installation and configuration chapter and in the RBAC section. In this video, we're talking about the optional part, that's creating a subject. I'm going to explain that later why it's optional, but it's important that you know that. In the Kubernetes, you need to authenticate before you allow to make a request to the API resources. Mostly, a cluster administrator usually has access to all resources and operations. But you need to create a role user to manage the authentication. So it's so important for the security. Now we can see that there is a tree building block in the RBAC that's important. One of them is subject that contain a user and process that wants to access the resources, and the API resources, that's the Kubernetes API resources type like a config map, pub, deployment node, and the operations that can execute on the resources like create, resource, watch, and delete. But now we mainly focus on the subject parts here. In the subject, the group and the users are not stored in the Kubernetes databases. It means that the process running outside of the cluster. So, user needs to be managed by administrators of the Kubernetes cluster and distribute the credentials to the real person. And it's used by the external process. But let's see how to authentication strategy for the RBAC subject. We can use the X.509 client certificate by OpenSSL, or we can use the basic authentication that uses the username and password to authenticate, or we can use the barrier tokens that use the OpenID, Auth2, or the webhook as a way of the authenticator. Now we're going to use the OpenSSL certificate, but you need to know that during the exam, you will not have to create the user for yourself. For the RBAC and the concept of the RBAC and how the RBAC workings, I explained that in the other video. But in this video, we're just going to create a certificate. It's optional, but it's important to know that. Let's go to the terminal and see how to create a user. So first we need to log into the Kubernetes control plane node or to create a temporary folder. Now I create a temporary folder that's cert. Now I go to the cert. Now I'm the cert, and here it's empty directory. First, we need to know that we need to create a private key. By the OpenSSL, we can create a private key. I heard that one before, so in the history I have some of the command. But for we need to generate a RSA, and we need to create a key. It's important that in every step we need to clear name. For example, I want to create a key for the user that name Sina. So now I'm going to create a key with the RSA, and my file is sina.key. Okay, now it's created. Let's see here. Now we have a key. Later, we need to create a certificate sign request. That's extension is CSR. So we need to pass the RSA. We need to pass the RSA or our key to create a sign request. In that command, that's request new key. The key that we're going to pass that Sina.key, and the out is Sina.csr. That's a certificate signed request. And for the subject, we can pass the CN as a username, and we can pass the O as a group. And here I pass Sina and the group as a developer. We can remove the O2 and just create a user. But now I use both of them. Okay, now we have a CSR and we have a key. The last part is to create a certificate actually. To create a certificate for the Kubernetes, we need to, as I said before, we need to create a certificate by X509. For that one, we need to pass the Kubernetes certificate. Now I'm using the Minikube, but usually the CA certificate is in the etcd Kubernetes PKI that needs to contain the ca.crt and ca.key. But here I'm using the Minikube, and in the Minikube you can find the CA certificate in this path, in the your home.minikube-ca.certificate. So we need to create a request to create a certificate and sign by the Minikube. So first we need to send our sign request. Then we need to pass our CA here with the CA certificate and the key. And we're going to say that we want to create a serial that's out by sina.crt. That's a CRT that we need for our context. And we need to create days for we're going to say that it needs to be valid for the 365. Okay, signature is okay, and create a private key. So now we can go and create a context for ourselves. So now we have a certificate, needs to create a user in the Kubernetes by setting the user in the Kubernetes config. Let's go to the kubectl config set credentials. We're going to create a config and set credential for the Sina. The client certificate, we're going to pass the sina.crt, and for the client key, we're going to pass sina.key. So now the user Sina set, we need to set the context to kubectl config set dash context. I'm going to create a Sina-context for the cluster Minikube and the user Sina. Now we have this context. We can check that context in the kube config. So now here in the user part, if we're going to check that, it's a user part. We have a user that's named Sina, and this user with the key that I passed. And here we need to have context that's see here, yeah, and we have a Sina context that's for the user Sina. Now I have a kubectx. Let's see. So now I'm using the Minikube context, so I can see the kubectl get node. I can use the kubectx command, but in the exam we need to use kubectl command. In the kubectl command we need to say that, okay, kubectl config use context, and that's SINA context. And we can say that, okay, kubeconfig. I can check my current context here first. That's a SINA context. If I check in the kubectx, okay, if you see that I'm in the SINA context. So if I now do the kubectl get node, I can say that, okay, it's forbidden, because now we just create a user. We didn't assign the role to that user to can access to the API resources. That's part of the RBAC video, that we're going to create a permission as a API resources or the other stuff for the developer group or for this user in the other video. So now we create a certificate and we create a context, and but we now connect with that context and it's working. So if you want to remove the context, we need to say that kubectl config. We can delete the context. That's a delete context, SINA context. That's deleted the context. And the other command that you can use, that's config for the user. You need to unset the users. So we need to say that kubectl config unset on the users. I want to remove the SINA. Okay, that's removed. Now when I check that one, okay, that's the old one, and we don't have that context here too. So now we're back to the clear one.